dark creatures that accompany humanity throughout its history and evolution. From dark creatures that haunt our very nightmares to sparkling daywalkers, let's talk about vampires. Hello everyone, Funky Monkey over here. On today's episode we'll be talking about vampires, and I need to put out a disclaimer. If you don't like very graphic depictions, if you have a problem with talking about vampires and their habits and their prey and people getting feasted upon, this is the perfect moment for you to click away. I won't hold it against you. I also have a problem with these kind of topics. But if you choose to stick around, I'll assume you know what you're getting yourself into. Just as a general note, I won't be going into very gruesome depictions. There are some unsavory details that I will be imparting with you. I am of the conviction that history and legends and myths shouldn't have a filter, and as such, I will be in a very proper way giving you enough details to paint the picture of what vampires throughout mythology are said to have done, or at least some of them. While we talk about this history of creatures that have roots in time immemorial, I will be painting something more appropriate for this episode. I'll be painting a vampire hexmage from WizKids. As you can see, this is quite a lovely little miniature, and I hope I can do it justice. Before we start our dive through this fascinating history, let me take a few moments and talk about my plans regarding this miniature. After base coating with storm vermin fur and zenithal priming with white scar, I started working on the skin, going for a bluish pale complexion. I planned for the hair to be red and a deep purple dress and solid black eyes for this vampire hexmage. The quality of the miniature is lower than I expected, to be honest, comparing it to the photo, but we'll manage. We all know that vampires are rich, they are very polite, they are very well mannered, they are very charming, very beautiful, immortal, they sparkle in the sunlight in certain circumstances, and most likely they were there when history was written. I'm sure that some of them were there when Caesar was assassinated, they were there when the First Crusade took place, I'm sure they took part in the Battle of Waterloo, they had a role to play in D-Day, and I'm sure that they also played a major role in the moon landing. But as all things around humanity, they required time to evolve and reach the form that we now recognize. If you go back far enough in history, you will be surprised at what you find. To be honest, I didn't know there were so many legends around vampires. I was taken a little bit aback, and it took me a few hours to sift through all the information and come up with a shorter list of entries that I personally believe to be most representative of vampires, and there are more clear landmarks through their evolution, so we understand where they come from and how they got to the form we recognize today. To do so, let us begin with our first entry. For this, we have to go to ancient Egypt almost 3,500 years ago. The first vampire on our list is the ancient Egyptian goddess Sekhmet. She is the daughter of Ra. She was a warrior goddess who also was in charge of healing and death, a quite interesting portfolio. He decided to send his daughter to our world to punish those who were unfaithful and disobedient. In order to fuel her powers, Sekhmet fed on human blood. The more she fed, the stronger she became, the more people she punished. Once Ra was satisfied with the justice his daughter dealt upon the world, he tried to recall her and quench her thirst for blood. To his shock, he discovered that she craved blood all the time. She became ever thirstier the more she killed. To quench his thirst, Ra came up with a brilliant idea. He took a very large quantity of beer, dyed it blood red, and convinced Sekhmet to drink it all, saying that it is sweet fresh blood. She did so, and by drinking such a large quantity of beer, she became satiated. She still was in charge of healing and death, she still remained a goddess warrior, and she still punished those unfaithful, but she no longer thirsted for blood. Now, I think this is the perfect moment to ask you if you've seen my video on what ancient people ate, among which ancient Egyptians. If you did so, please accept my sincerest apologies. I forgot to add fresh blood to the list, but if you haven't seen it yet, please make sure you do so. Link will be right over there, and then make sure you leave a comment down below telling me what you thought about it. Now let's talk about the Middle East. In the Middle East we have the Sumerians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians. All share history, a culture, civilization. They follow one another in history, and as such we will be talking about them as a whole. They also share mythology and most religious elements. The Sumerians had Akharu, a bloodthirsty creature that stalked the night. The Babylonians had Lilu, a female demon that stalked the night and especially feasted on pregnant women and on children. From what legends tell us, these creatures were very easy to summon into our world through very basic rituals, and once they entered our world, they immediately sought to feast. If they drank enough human blood, they would eventually turn into humans themselves. The demon called Lilu is believed to be the inspiration for the Hebrew Lilith. In the Judeo-Christian world, she is believed to be Adam's first wife. She was made of the same clay as Adam was, and because she didn't obey Adam, she didn't submit to him, she was banished from Eden. As a personal note, good for her. She is said to have mated with Asmodeus, and in my opinion that is an awesome twist or an awesome element that can be easily integrated in a Dungeons and Dragons campaign or any other TTRPG that deals with demons, devils, and the such. In the Hebrew folklore we have an additional vampire-like creature, an estri. Estries have their origin in the Roman world, where we have strigas and strix, we'll get to that, and they are considered to be creatures that take female form and feast upon the blood of their victims. They can also take the form of birds or of cats and thus get closer to their victims. They could fly as long as their hair was unbound. If you wanted to make sure that an estri does not fly away, all you had to do was bind their hair. An interesting aspect is that they weren't deterred by holy symbols. They could easily enter holy places, they could receive blessings, and they were very easy to wound actually. They didn't require a lot of effort when it came to taking them out. If they were wounded, they could easily regenerate by drinking blood or by eating bread and salt received from their attacker. Later interpretations bring them closer to things that we now recognize as being vampires. In later iterations, they were more vulnerable to silvered weapons, to silver bullets, to blessed weapons, and to holy symbols and holy or blessed water. Before we continue with the Greek and the Roman world, let's take a moment and see how the miniature is coming along. Initially, I added shadows to the folds of the dress using Druchii Violet, but they weren't dark enough. I then turned to my trusty Nuln Oil to get the job done. I made sure I used it to accentuate the shadows all around the miniature, not only in the folds of the dress. A little Nuln Oil goes a long way. And sorry for the focus, I'm still learning, still experimenting. Welcome back. In the Greek world, we have Empusa. Empusa was one of the daughters of the goddess Hecate. Hecate was the goddess of crossroads, entranceways, night, light, witchcraft, magic and the moon, herbalism, graves, ghosts, necromancy, and sorcery. She was quite a busy goddess. Empusa was represented as having a bronze leg, while the other was that of a donkey, and she would usually take the form of a very beautiful young woman that seduced men in order to feast upon them. As they had intercourse and they lay asleep next to her, she would slice them open and feast upon their blood and their innards. Apparently, the best way of defending oneself from an Empusa was hurling insults at her. That's a fairly strange one. This apparently made her shriek and run away. Another vampire-like creature in Greek mythology is Lamia. Lamia was a queen of Libya who had an affair with Zeus and bore a few of his children. Upon hearing this, Hera, who was always jealous and never did anything to Zeus about it, or rarely did, kidnapped and killed all of Lamia's children with the exception of one, Scylla. Hera also cursed her to never be able to close her eyes. This could also be interpreted as not being able to sleep, as she was always hunted by the image of her murdered children. Driven mad by grief, Lamia turned into a monster and started hunting children, feasting upon them. In an attempt to somewhat appease her, Zeus gifted her with the gift of prophecy and the ability of removing her own eyes, in an attempt to perhaps get some relief or sleep a little bit from time to time. Later, in the Middle Ages, Lamia is represented as a creature with the upper body of a woman and the lower half of the body of a snake. The Romans had the Strix or the Striges, or more commonly the Striga. If you've ever played or watched or read any of the Witcher games, series or books, you might be familiar with the Striga. Strix or Striges are witches that can shapeshift into screech owls, while in this form they are known to kidnap children and infants from their beds and from their cribs and drink their blood and feast upon their innards. Because of this association to creatures that feast upon blood and flesh, especially of children, even to this day in certain parts of Europe, screech owls are considered to be harbingers of doom. They are bad omens. Now, we will be moving to Asia, and before we do so, let's take a moment, talk about the miniature, and then we'll come back. After working on the eyes and painting them with very thin down Incubi darkness before going in with the black, I turned my attention to the dress once more. Using a mix of Nagaroth Night and Dechala Lilac, I am adding highlights to the dress. Initially, I wanted to go for a 50-50 mix, but it was too bright, so I settled for a 75-25 mix. Testing it on my fingernail before applying it to the mini, as to ensure there is a little bit of transparency in there. Using a very thin brush, I'm painting only the raised areas, leaving the shadows untouched. Welcome back. In India, we have Brahma Parusha. This is an especially cruel and evil spirit that feasts on human flesh, human blood, and its brains. Once it captured its victim, it makes sure to drain all of its blood into a skull that this spirit uses as a cup. After drinking all of the blood, the spirit feasts on the flesh and organs of the victim and finishes his feast with dessert, the brains of the victim. This particular entity is a nightmarish vampire-zombie combo that I really didn't want to know about, but it is what it is. I sacrifice myself for history, D&D, and for you. As a trophy, the Brahma Parusha wears its victim's intestines as a necklace and as a crown. There are no known ways of warding off the Brahmaparusha. The only known way of escaping this particular entity is by running away and hiding. There is also no known way of summoning or creating such an entity, and nobody really knows if they were summoned or if they are vengeful spirits that come back for some reason. Other nightmarish entities here in India are the Vetalas and the Pisachas. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these names correctly, but this is how you spell them. These are creatures that during the day inhabit bodies, so they are hidden in plain sight, and at night feast upon flesh and blood. They are known to hang upside down in cremation fields and in cemeteries. These are a very, very nightmarish combo between a vampire and a ghoul. Apparently in India you have all these weird and frightening combos. Sure. But you also have the opposite. You have the goddess Kali. She is one of the most famous vampires. She has vampire fangs, she has 4 arms, she wears a necklace of skulls around her neck, and her temples are found next to cremation fields or next to cemeteries. She is the goddess that destroys all evil in order to protect innocence. She is the supreme power and she is the supreme reality. She is a clear departure from the Vetalas, the Pisachas, and Brahmaparusha. With that, let us move to the Philippines, where we have the Manananggal. I think I'm pronouncing it right. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. This is how you spell it. This creature is depicted as a woman that can sever and separate her torso from the rest of her body, and she sprouts bat wings and a very long protruding tongue. Its favorite prey are sleeping pregnant women. Actually, the unborn children of sleeping pregnant women. With her insect-like tongue, she feasts upon the heart of the unborn child and drinks its blood. This creature is described as having very classic weaknesses such as salt, garlic, and holy or blessed water. Let's move to Africa, where we have the Asanbosan or the Sasabosam. These are creatures that are depicted as having iron teeth, pink skin, red hair, and iron hooks on their feet. They are depicted as hanging from tree branches and feasting upon anyone who dares enter their territory. When they take humanoid form, they also have wings that span 20 feet or a little over 6 meters. With all of that, let's take a moment, talk about the miniature, and then we'll come back and talk about Daywalkers and other famous vampires. With a thin brush, I highlighted the skin using thin down pure undead flesh from MSP Bones. As before, I tested the consistency and transparency of the paint on my fingernail. Now I'm attempting to paint the eye with pure Abaddon Black, a process that requires a steady hand, patience, and a good dose of skill. But, as always, I lack all of them and I screw up the right eye, again. As a result, I washed my brush and I'm trying desperately to clean the mess up with water, but to no avail. I have to go back to the thin down incubi darkness and redo the whole eye. Yay! Welcome back, let's move on. If you've ever wondered what came out of the union between a male vampire and a female human mortal, well, the answer is quite simple: a Dhampir. These individuals were very, very special. They had the ability of going invisible, they had the ability of practicing sorcery, they could feel, they could sense vampires in their proximity, they would regenerate really fast, they would be immortal, and like Blade, they would be Daywalkers. They would be able to control animals, they would enjoy and benefit from consuming normal food. More often than not, they became vampire hunters. To be honest, I took a lot of inspiration from these individuals and created the whole vampire slaying order in my fantasy world, in my campaign. Now let's talk about what I consider to be the best known 5 vampires, at least here in the Western world. Vlad the Impaler, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, Nosferatu, Blade, and Edward Cullen from Twilight. Of course, there are many others, but I'm just not familiar with any others than these 5 that I just listed. Let's start by talking about Vlad the Impaler. 1428 or 1431 date of birth and 1477 date of death. Now, I strongly believe that Vlad the Impaler deserves a video of his own because he has a very fascinating and very complicated life, but this time we will be listing only the most prominent features that aided Bram Stoker in creating Count Dracula. First, Vlad was the second son of a knight belonging to the Order of the Dragon. In medieval Romanian, dragons were associated with the devil, and as such, a rough translation of the dragon is Dracul, so basically the devil. Later, this gave birth to Dracula. He became voivode of the Kingdom of Wallachia and a stern opponent of the Ottoman Empire. Through sheer luck, cunning, genius, and subterfuge, he was able to defeat the Ottoman armies on multiple occasions, even though the odds were heavily stacked against him. His preferred method of punishing his opponents and the prisoners he and his armies captured on the battlefield was impalement. This gave him his famous nickname, the Impaler, Vlad the Impaler. Rumors and stories circulated that he enjoyed drinking the blood of his victims. These were most likely fabricated by his opponents, especially the boyars he purged upon taking over in Wallachia, and their relatives. 400 years after his death, in the 19th century, Bram Stoker created, leaning heavily on the stories, the legends, and the myths surrounding Vlad the Impaler, created Count Dracula. A 15th century Wallachian voivode became one of the most renowned vampires in fiction. Let's move on to Hungary, where we have Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or the Bloody Countess, Hungarian noblewoman and alleged serial killer between 1560 and 1614. I say alleged because there are two camps: those who believe she was framed and wrongfully executed for something she never did, and there are those who believe she was a cold-hearted, savage serial killer. In her childhood, she suffered from seizures, most likely epilepsy. One remedy used for those who suffered from seizures was to rub the blood of non-sufferers on the lips of those afflicted. This is a good explanation of how she developed a taste for blood, and it's a good explanation of how she became a vampire. Legend has it that she would bathe in the blood of virgins in order to maintain her youth, and she gained a lot of pleasure from torturing and maiming her servants. Her alleged victims were daughters of lesser noblemen and people of status who sent their offsprings to her court in order to learn mannerism. If she was indeed a serial killer, the theoretical number of her victims is upwards of 300 individuals. Now, while scholars still debate around her innocence, let us move on and talk about Nosferatu. We know him, we love him, at least for a short while before he feasts on our blood, and he is basically a ripoff, or started off as a ripoff of Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's work. I say it started as a knockoff because the creators of Nosferatu weren't actually legally allowed to come up with a cinematographic adaptation of the novel. His name, Nosferatu comes from the Greek nosophoros, which means the disease bringer. Many vampires were considered to be bringers of disease and of course bringers of death. Now let's move on to a Daywalker. Let's talk about Blade. Now, he is the offspring of a male vampire and a female mortal. He is in essence a Demphier, and he is a really badass character. If you haven't seen the movies, haven't read the comic books, I strongly recommend you do so. Let's wrap things up with Edward Cullen. I don't know what to say about Edward Cullen and his adoptive family. They sparkle in the sunlight, they are daywalkers, and for me they are the equivalent of people who ate meat all their life and then one day they decided to go vegetarian, but without true conviction. They still crave burgers and steaks and dream about it, but they wanna be strong. This is how I see the vampires, especially Edward Cullen and his family in the movie's Twilight. Basically horny for blood, but abstinent. I'm sorry to any Twilight fan out there, but yeah, they're horny for blood and that's it. Again, I don't know why they sparkle in the sun, but they have superhuman strength, they have superhuman agility, they have the gift of prophecy, they can work some magic, interesting, they check all the stereotypical boxes that a vampire should, but they still sparkle in the damn sun. Weird. And I can't let you go before I mention my favorite group of vampires, those depicted by Sir Terry Pratchett in the Discworld. Individuals who wear very bright vivid colors, who drink wine and stay up until noon. At one point they integrate in society and become reliable members of the Night Watch. And with that, let's take one last look at the miniature before we wrap things up. With almost everything else done by now, I am now focusing on the hair. Using a mix of corn red and mephistone red, I am adding highlights to the vampire's hair. I'm trying to leave much of the corn red in place and only paint areas that would naturally catch the light, and the tips of the hair. The difference is not that easy to spot in the video as the nuances are quite close to one another, but it's getting there, and off camera the difference is a little bit more visible, trust me. Welcome back, let's wrap things up. We spoke of vampires, we spoke of vampire-like creatures, and we spoke of Demphiers. Now let's talk about the natural occurrences that might have sparked the imagination of our ancestors and led to the creation of such beings. First, living in a world where infant and child mortality was really high, a world in which pregnant women were at high risk and women died during childbirth, a world in which there were cultures that didn't name their children until the age of 3 just in case they died before that, a world in which religion and rituals and superstitions were cornerstones, gave birth to entities that were responsible for things going horribly wrong in an instant. It was impossible for them to explain through science because they lacked the knowledge how a child left in their crib died overnight. It was easier to explain that a striga came and drained its blood. It was easier to explain that a woman had a miscarriage because Manangal came and fed upon its heart and blood. In my opinion, the lack of knowledge and the inability to prevent most of the things led to the creation of evil and cruel entities that attacked children and women and those vulnerable. A second reason, I think, were disease, especially two certain diseases that shook humanity and gave it nightmares. First, rabies. Even to this day, rabies is deadly. There are countries such as Great Britain that managed to eradicate rabies, but in most parts of the world, rabies is still occurring, although rarely. A patient with rabies would behave like a wild animal. They would lunge at those around them, trying to bite them while frothing at the mouth. This is a disease that spreads through bites. Of course, it traumatized individuals. And once you contracted this disease, there was no chance for you to survive. Dogs are usually those associated with rabies, but in rural areas, people had to make sure they don't come into contact with wolves or other animals that might carry rabies. This is why so many stories and legends and myths revolving around dark forests, haunted forest came to be. A second interesting condition is Porphyria cutanea tarda. This is a blood disease that affects the skin. This condition is also called the vampire disease. Those afflicted with this rare condition suffer immense pain when exposed to sunlight. Does it sound familiar? Their skin, when exposed to sunlight, develops painful, blistering lesions, rashes. They suffer from liver disease. They have a very low red blood cell count, leading to a very pale complexion. And in some cases, their fragile skin could lead to the individual suffering from this condition to lose their nose and or ears. This, of course, leaves the individual in immense pain and trauma, and of course leaves them with a very strange visage. In ancient and medieval times, people looking upon such an individual could say that they had demonic, evil visage. Oh, and an additional symptom of this particular condition is the retraction of the gums, exposing more of the teeth. These are the basic features of your average vampire. That's why, in my opinion, this is yet another example of a condition that sparks imagination of humans. One other element, as far as I'm concerned, that contributed to the propagation of these myths and legends was an overactive imagination. People who wanted to enthrall and to shock and to scare their audience. And with the help of minstrels and troubadours and other lore keepers, they were able to spread and evolve. If you want to have a better understanding of why I consider this to be a reason, make sure you check out my videos on bards and lore keepers throughout history, as they have a very important role to play in this as well, at least as far as I'm concerned. And a last reason for creating such monstrous horrors was the need for parents to scare the living shit out of their children, so that they would behave and obey them. And with that, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. I truly hope you found some inspiration and learned something new today. And I can't wait to see you all here next week on Funky Monkey MP, the place where you get your weekly dose of miniature painting, history, and world building. Have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Cheers.